Okay, this is our talk about, yeah, I can add it in post. This is our talk about production phases. We're going to go from pre-production to post-production. This is going to be kind of a long video. Normally I would have examples. I actually made another video. Look, we're going to do what we can. We're going to tell you what we're thinking. If we're wrong, we're wrong. You can tell us how we're wrong. Let's jump right into it. Okay, so production phases, I think everybody understands that they're just different phases to define game development, and what phase you're on can often determine different ways of building the game, working on the game, and of course, what you want to show to the public generally, or what you want to consider a certain type of build. And this is a useful talk both for gamers and game developers. When you start to see, trailers on Summer Games Fest, or just posted on YouTube of something that calls itself pre-alpha or beta, what does it look like behind the scenes for that, and how is that defined internally? The issue with this is that every game development company generally defines some of these as something different. And for a different scope of games, you may not have to go through some of these phases, right? If you're making a super simple 2D game, or you're just making even just a small game to test an idea, you probably don't have to go through all these phases that we're going to talk about today. But it's good to understand the methodology so that if you do start to build something with a larger scope, you can look at it in a proper view. And if you've been following our Cauldron Chronicles development, you'll know that we are following this very strictly. We want to be sure that when we go to the next phase, that we are sure that we have passed the milestone requirements for the previous phases. And I'll talk a bit about why that's so important when we get to it. Here is the full chart. Of course, we go from the idea phase, the conceptual phase. I'm going to close this panel if I can. And I view shapes. There we go. That helps a bit. And we can push this up. Starting with the idea conceptual phase, this is the start of pre-production, of course. You don't know what game you're even making. You don't know what's going to be in it. You just have some rough ideas, some things where you might think, okay, it would be cool if blank would be in our game, right? This is considered pre-production phase. You have not started developing the game. You've just started to explore the ideas that you think will make the game fun, will make the game important, will make the game unique, things like that. And again, we're going to go into deeper discussions of what these mean in a second. I just want to go through each phase. Starting off with production, you have your first playable, moving into your vertical slice, then to your alpha. These are all considered pre-alpha usually. You don't really see developers sharing with players that this is pre-vertical slice. Usually you don't really see any builds from first playable to vertical slice because developers are trying to be secretive, not necessarily out of nefarious reasons, but they understand that the game in its early state is very raw. It looks really bad, and they might be using tons of placeholder things that just don't look enjoyable. So you often don't see phases like this. Vertical slice is, the cake analogy I think is the best one to use here. If you take a slice of a cake, you're getting all the flavors that cake has. You're just not getting the whole cake. So it's a very small bit of work that you need to do comparatively to the rest of the game to show off everything that game has to offer. All of its systems, all of its the interesting visual aspects of it. Really, it comes down to that, systems and visuals. It should provide a very small section of the game that showcases most of the things your game is going to have. Moving on, we have alpha and beta. These are kind of understandable, but again, we're going to dive deeper into just what that means kind of behind the scenes. And then we move on to like release and then post production after that, which is like DLC and updates, things like that, right? That can kind of stretch on. And for games that are also live service, this model of post-production doesn't really play into it, just because there are different ways to define that. The game's not really ever finished, right? You can think of an MMO or other multiplayer games like that that are live service. They don't really have an end. The end is when the players stop playing the game, because then it isn't financially viable to keep making the game. Starting out with pre-production, we're going to keep it really simple. What do you need to start to get into your game? A general idea, obviously, a one sheet, which can cover like a small pitch, a competition, genre, platforms, audience, selling points, inspiration, just the things that will give the people reading that sheet, and it should be a one sheet of paper ideally, a quick overview of, okay, this sounds interesting, it's similar to these games, you're inspired by these games, or not even other games, but other like movies or books, other things that have inspired you to make this. And then a gameplay loop and pillars. Now, some of this can be made at any point. You might just be exploring ideas, right? And your gameplay loop and pillars can be made throughout the idea phase, because it might change a little bit. So just remember that those are kind of the things that you develop while in this idea phase, working towards your first playable. In short, have everything necessary to get everyone on the same page, but don't let it become set in stone. Everything might change. That's okay. You just want to push towards the fun of the game, right? Fun is king. Fun is king. For those new to it, what do you mean by pillars there? So pillars are generally the things that are the most important aspects of your game, like the functional core ideas or systems that will define what your game is. For a racing game, it could be the feeling of driving. It can be abstract, it can be specific. It really is going to be what is going to be something that you don't want to ever compromise on. What do you want to pour most of your money into? What do you think is going to be the biggest selling point of the game? Although selling points are a little bit different than pillars. There is some overlap, of course, just because your pillars are probably some of the most important aspects, and you put so much money and time into them that you make them unique, and they have selling points because of how much uniqueness or fun that you've made because of it. And pillars are also things that the designers, the game designers especially, uphold. We don't want to fuck with that. We don't want anyone else to make something that contradicts what those pillars mean. And I can show you like an example of some pillars that I've made before. Really, I like to do them in a way where I kind of look at them like those old Roman pillars. Usually they were made with like multiple sections of stone, right? You can kind of see it here. They're usually like multiple pieces of stone stacked on top of each other sometimes. Not always, but that's how I like to visualize it personally. And each of those are like, to me, I view them as sub-pillars. You have your main pillar. Now, what are the aspects of that pillar that matter the most? What things are you trying to achieve? Emotions that you need to convey, that anything that you make going forward, you don't want to compromise on. But every development studio and every designer might have a slightly different explanation of pillars or a different way that they view it. Game design is an ever-changing thing. It's not something you can ever become a master at, but it is something that you can learn to keep yourself up to date with and to constantly redefine it, iterate on it, and change with the times. So things like what appeals to your target audience, your user experience goals, key game mechanics, exactly. For instance, the core pillars of our Cauldron Chronicles game are alchemy, open world, and NPCs. And these sound really simple, but again, it's because I use this sub pillar that I can define the aspects of those that are really important to the game and that I want to emphasize the most. But this can be anything, even I know God of War shared their design pillars a while back. Just grab the images here. This is a really good example. Combat, father-son, exploration. And then they kind of have these sub pillars too of the aspects of those pillars that they want to emphasize the most and they want to spend the most amount of time and money on. So it's like that. It's abstract, it's hard to explain, and there's no defined, like, hey, if you follow this instruction list at the end, you'll find your 3 pillars or 4 pillars. There's no specific amount of pillars you should have, but you also shouldn't have too many. Your game might be really simple that you only have 1 or 2. It's variable, right? You need to think of what are the most important and break it down and define it. And it's hard to do, but you need to do it. Sometimes it's hard to do, I'll say that. So what does this pre-production phase look like? Now I call this the prototyping phase. Even though you do prototypes throughout all of development, this is a phase that I like to call specifically the prototyping phase. It's chaotic, it's rapid development and iteration of prototypes. Continuous, honest feedback is absolutely necessary. And if fun doesn't exist in this phase, it's not gonna come after pre-production. You can't just wait, oh, well, maybe it'll be fun after we add this feature or we refine it. No, if the fun doesn't exist here, trust me, you're not gonna find it later without a significant amount of overhauling. And you wanna embrace creativity here. A lot of publishers or development managers, they really like order. They like the structure that comes with production because they have milestones, they have dates, they can tell those dates to investors and publishers. But guess what? Pre-production, you shouldn't have those kinds of things. You shouldn't have super strict structures and milestones. There's no milestones here. It's let's just keep working and iterating quickly and changing things until it's fun. Embrace the creativity, don't stifle it with rules and restrictions. Now, in order for your production phase to be finished and enter what's called a first playable, you need to kind of think of what your first playable is at its core. And it's the general idea of the game is conveyed through 1 or more playable prototypes. It does not have to be in the same project, right? It could be multiple different projects that you can lead a player through, either through a demonstration or they can play themselves in order to understand each aspect of the game. But 2 important aspects that we've kind of gone over. The gameplay loop needs to be fully realized. Whatever gameplay loop you have in mind needs to be there. Everything, absolutely everything that is core and essential. And the fun factor needs to be there. It needs to be fun and basic, simple to get and to play through. It doesn't always have to look the greatest. It doesn't always have to play the greatest, but it shouldn't be frustrating. You use placeholder assets in UI, you white box where possible. Making art, spending time on huge quality of life investments is not worthwhile of a first playable. Those are things that can be iterated on during the production of that feature fully and during iterations of that feature. You should not be spending time doing pointless things in your production, in your prototyping phase. However, that doesn't always mean that you'll get it right. It's very easy to say, well, I could just make this make it look a little bit better, make it feel a little bit better. It's okay to do that a little bit, but just realize, don't do it too much because it's adding unnecessary time for you to question the biggest thing. Is it fun? So what's needed to move towards your vertical slice? Your GDD, number one. You should have your full GDD written up. Of course, this is something that you'll maintain and you'll update throughout all of production, but you should have a GDD created so that you have a blueprint and the associated prototypes then too, to show here's what we have in mind, here's our prototype of it, and when we go to create it, when we set up the time frame to actually work on the real system here, we have things to start with, and we can assign a designer, or we can sit down with the designer and other important team members to make this system, and have as much information starting from the same idea, and something that we can play and feel and understand what the goals are. Reiterate on the gameplay loop and pillars where necessary. Your gameplay pillars may not have been set in stone, but this is where they need to be. You're starting production. This is where you need to define exactly what they mean, what the goals are, what they're doing for the player, and how they're making the gameplay loop fun. And you plan here to create production-ready tools, assets, code, and pipelines. This is just the planning, right? You need to plan. You can't just jump from your first playable into the vertical slice. There's a lot of planning that needs to go behind it, a lot of production code that is put in place before you actually start to build the systems on top of it. So just really think about that. And the more time you spend making sure your pre-production is good and your planning is great, the easier vertical slice is going to go. And the easier vertical slice goes and the better it feels and looks, trust me, alpha and beta will be a breeze. It's a lot of work, but it will be a lot easier because you've built on such a solid foundation of principles and ideas and pillars. Moving on to production, and this is the meaty one, right? But I don't want that to make it sound like production is the most important. Let me answer this. So your GDD should include every aspect of the game in full detail because that makes your GDD very static. A lot of that can come later, especially if using an agile sprint style project management method. Yeah, at the very least, in this phase of pre-production, your GDD should at least have all of the high-level design. And high-level design compared to low-level design is, well, we want fruit, and it's going to have this in the game and look like this, but you don't need to worry about how many hit points does it heal. No. Does it heal hit points? Yes, okay. We can balance that later, but we know the functions that it needs to serve in the game. We know the actions that the player needs to do with it, but we just don't know how it's going to look or sound yet. It's just the player can eat food in the game. Okay, and it does effects. And that, at least, your GDD should include the high level of that. Trust me, I have seen managers get really excited at seeing low-level design at a high-level phase like this in pre-production. And I can give you an example. Here is what I would consider low-level data, which is like this. You don't need to show this before your game is even made. If this helps you to think about how to structure your data better, go for it. This is low level. You don't care about the specifics, don't care about the details. And if we want to have like a small little like educational thing on design and all that, I can do that. So your first playable to vertical slice is a really crucial part that I've seen developers not get right. And I can tell you there are a lot of games that have been released this year, 2023, where I guarantee that they did not do this phase properly. Because ideally you should scrap all of your prototype code. You should not be using the same project to build your game that you built your prototype in. It's a reference. It should serve as a reference. Your code there should serve as a reference of what you did to achieve it and what the goals were. But you should be building new code on top of a solid foundation of code framework in a new project. Don't get tempted. And here is where process becomes relevant and chaos is abandoned. It's very important now to determine the number of things that you need, because a vertical slice is not your entire game. It is a small section of your game. You need to determine, what do you need to achieve your vertical slice? How many NPCs do you want? How many quests do you want to be showcased here? How many, if it's a driving game, how many cars? Probably only one, because you don't need more cars. Or if the game itself is very based on switching cars, only have 2. You only need 2 to explain that your car can be switched. If you have upgrades, only have a couple of upgrades. That just shows that you will have upgrades, and you've proven that you can make that, and you know how much time you need to make an upgrade, to make a new car. All aspects of development become important here, as what is being created is a mini version of your game. This means that you will polish, iterate, and bug fix constantly. That's really important too, because you need to make sure that you're creating pipelines here that are actually, that you can iterate on even further and you can take even further without building on a shoddy foundation. Regular playtesting by all members and teams. Really, you should be doing this at all phases of development anyway, but it's important here. And a lot of companies will just offload this to internal or external QA. I don't think that's the right thing to do. If you're a designer, if you're a programmer, you can't really know how your system works if you don't test it yourself. You can't rely on QA to understand what your goals were individually. And I think one of the most important thing here is that you are, during this phase, building up your vertical slice. You are defining the pipelines and guidelines, documentation methodology while developing. If you build that system to create a new car, document how you did it. Iterate on it. Find ways that you could have done it simpler and quicker. Document who of your team, what part of your team was necessary to bring it from concept to completion. How much time did they need to make it? And I can't emphasize enough that the more time you spend making sure that you've documented this, the better it is. If you can look at it and you can say, okay, I needed a designer for 4 hours, I needed a 3D artist for 2 days, so 16 hours of their work period, or ideally you have like 6 hours of work during an 8-hour day, so 12 hours, right? How many of, sound design, the environment artists, level designers, how many of these, how much time of them did you need to get from car concept to car completion? And the better you document this, the more easy it will be to plan the rest of the things. I was going to ask, does the vertical slice serve any other purposes other than being used in pitching the game to publishers, other talent, hype up the game, but you answered most of that when talking about it. Exploring more efficient ways, yeah. And additionally, the vertical slice is just a great demo. If you do your vertical slice correctly, it is a great thing to just share. Like, hey, this is a lot of work. This is a lot of time. But I'll tell you what, if your first playable was fun, and you did vertical slice properly, your vertical slice should be fun. But you need to test that. Give it to people, and if it isn't, trust me, cut your losses. Find a new game. Or you probably screw it up. Because if your first playable is fun and your vertical slice isn't fun, you probably screw it up, and you need to go back and you need to iterate. You need to find out, what did we do in the first playable that made this fun? And why is it not fun in the vertical slice? Maybe it is something like, in the first playable, when you walked over a flower, you could just press E and it was instantly added to your inventory. But we added an animation in vertical slice, and now it's just tedious. Let's just get rid of the animation, or shorten it, or make it not interrupt the gameplay flow. And these are things that you could have thought were actually making the vertical slice higher quality, but really they were detracting from what made it fun. A good example of this is like in the new Final Fantasy game. The pickups they were automatic. You didn't have to press a button. It's little things like this can actually turn a gameplay system from annoying to fun or fun to annoying in a matter of a day of development. Okay, so what does a vertical slice look like? How do you quantify it? How do you qualify it? Things like that. And may not be something you've done either. Genres get normalized, someone brings out something similar. Iterating gives you a chance to add a twist and adjust your gameplay again. 100% agree. How much of that do you think is based on the gamer's playstyle? Knowing your market is something that you need to know throughout all phases of development. You could be marketing towards an older audience or a younger one, and based on the games that they play, or based on similar games in competing games or games that are your inspiration, players might have different expectations of how that system is going to work. If you make a new first-person shooter and your inspirations are, Doom or, Call of Duty or something, and you go with a different style of shooting and moving than those games do, which I think they're probably pretty similar, players are going to come in there and probably feel like it's weird or it doesn't feel right. Like, you clearly marketed the game towards them, but now you've given them a game that they don't quite understand a basic aspect of. So knowing your market is, it's something we did first with Cauldron Chronicles. We anticipate that our market is going to be 18 to 35-year-old, primarily females, about 70 to 30% females to males. Knowing this, we know what aspects of our game we need to push further. Like, for instance, women by and large really prefer to get into individual characters and narratives. They like a lot of character customization, things like that. So pushing those aspects of our game further and making sure that they're iterated on in the vertical slice and are on display well in the vertical slice can make sure that we're actually appealing to the right audience. You can make a good game, you can market it to the wrong audience and have that game fail and not be fun by the people buying it. You can make a great game, you can even have it tested by people who aren't part of your audience, and they could give you feedback that just, if you don't know any better, you can think, oh, well, our game, I guess, isn't that great. No, you just got testers that weren't actually part of your core audience. You need to narrow this down. Your game is not going to appeal to everyone, nor should it. I don't think there's any game in the world that can appeal to everyone. And that's what you're dealing with. Also, hello, everybody. I start talking about vertical slice, and it seems to bring everybody out. Also, sorry, my voice might be going a little bit, so bear with me. Okay, so what does a vertical slice look like? How do we define it? A vertical slice, as we mentioned, is a small section of your game that completely covers your gameplay loop and systems in release quality, or quality that would be release ready. That doesn't mean that everything in your vertical slice is going to be what is seen in release. We see that a lot. We see demos of Witcher 3 and Watch Dogs are big ones where they were downgraded quite a bit. And arguably, I would say that they didn't do the vertical slice correctly in that regard, because they need to test performance at different levels, but it just happens. There's going to be some changes that happen between vertical slice and your release. It's understandable. Budgets change. You may not have properly planned out how much time it takes to make something at a certain quality level. You do your best, right? But it's not always perfect. And all pipelines for all teams should be defined and ready for production phase. Though of course, improvements and iteration will likely happen during these other phases too. The importance of this is that again, this goes back to planning. If you set up your pipeline and you know how much time it takes to make a new car, a new weapon, a new potion, anything, the better you can understand, okay, it takes about 4 total man hours to make a new potion. We want to have 100 potions. It's 400 hours, and it's broken down into this for the 3D artist, 2D artist, designer, sound designer, coder, whatever. And then we can say, okay, if we have, this much time of our 2 desired years of development or 3 desired years, already our coders are almost full with that. So we need to either cut down on how much time it takes to make this, cut down in the amount of potions we want, or hire more programmers so that one programmer or our programming team can have enough time to focus on the amount that we want and still have time to build the other things that we need. It's a lot of planning. It's just, I know a lot of teams that just kind of, they treat this as one constantly flowing machine, and they just want to go, oh, well, yeah, we're kind of at vertical slice, let's just keep going. Now, it's good enough. We didn't get everything we wanted to in there, but we'll just keep going. Dangerous. That's how you create tech debt. That's how you have tools that aren't even ready to build the rest of the game yet, or pipelines that aren't set in stone, and now you don't know how much time you need to create the rest of the game. Don't do it. Properly finish your vertical slice. So what is needed to begin your alpha phase? An updated production schedule and a production blueprint of what you can accomplish in the time frame you have. Makes sense, right? You have a new set of data to work with. You need to update your estimations based on that. And this is a good place to do first round of cutting content in order to fit things into schedule, because you have just that better data to work with. All tools and software necessary for production phase. This is really big. You can't start going into producing larger bits of content without having your tools, your software, your pipelines actually ready for it. If you need to iterate on your tools, take the time, iterate. Otherwise, your alpha is now going to be delayed, which delays your beta, which delays your release, and everything. And here, of course, finalize your gameplay loop and pillars. If there's any small changes that need to be made based on the iterations that you have from making the vertical slice, set in stone. This is it. We are not changing the gameplay loop, and we're not changing the pillars after this. Usually you would probably have done that at some phase, but just know that you're about to enter the meat of production. You cannot change that anymore without significant changes probably to the rest of the game and the schedule. Okay, so what does it look like going towards alpha phase? Give me a second to drink. Never really looked up what the difference between alpha and beta in game. I would say that is that's a very big question mark for a lot of gamers. And unfortunately, alpha and beta are they're defined differently based on different studios. The most important thing about how you define your alpha and beta is having a set in stone definition. The most important thing about it is just having a definition in the first place. Because if you don't know what it looks like as a company, as a team, then how do you know that you've crossed that threshold, right? So really, you could say that for all these phases. We have reasons why we have our vertical slice and alpha and beta being defined as such, but it's just important to have that definition in the first place so that we can, as managers or as team members, look at it and say, everybody in the room, do you guys agree that our vertical slice right now properly represents a vertical slice that we define it as? Because if you don't have a definition, it's easy for managers to say, no, we're past it. We did it. Our vertical slice happened on November 14th, and so now we're in working towards alpha. Yeah, okay. Define what that means. So what does alpha look like? It's a rapid whiteboxing of world to represent your scope. Now, you could say that to some extent that matters for like open worlds, right? Your game may not be open world, but really you want to rapidly whitebox the rest of the game. It's kind of very similar to what you did for your prototyping, just quickly fill it up with placeholder content so that, and this is really so that other team members can come in and start to do their work that they know is going to exist. Levels are iterated on constantly until a desired level of enjoyment is reached. So you have this vertical slice, which is your idealized core of the game, right? And a good example that I use for a good vertical slice is Witcher 3, White Orchard. This to me is an exceptional vertical slice. Just lost power, need to head to bed anyway. Hey, thanks for being here, and hope you check it out later. A good example of a good vertical slice to me is White Orchard. It encapsulates everything that Witcher 3 wants to be in a very small bit. You have all of the fights, you have all the quests, you have, you have small villages, you have NPCs, you have a quest board, you have loot, you have secrets, you have the meditation stones. Everything's on display here. Everything that's in the final game, just in a smaller scale. So moving past that, you want to keep that core, which is your ideal state. And you can look at and say, okay, is this new mesh that I'm building, this new level that I'm building, is it up to the same quality as our vertical slice? And you keep working on it and iterating on it until it is. Art is made and added, prioritized based on which sections should be tested and showed off first. Prioritization is going to be done by your producer or publisher. Maybe they want to show off a new biome, so you work on this, or maybe you're just trying to build the next like story element of your game. If it's open world, maybe you have the next city that the player is going to be going to, and you want to build that up first so that you can test how it feels for the player to be moving from one part of the world to another, and how it feels to progress that main story. Testing is continuous and regressive. Super important, just keep testing and testing and testing. Whole team, QA departments especially, keep working on that. And production does continuous checks to see if cuts are needed to fit scope. Again, we went over the known unknown matrix before. Maybe you've watched that video, maybe not. You need to determine if you've come up with some delays and you need to push things back, or if you're able to push things back, great. If not, you need to make some cuts then. Okay, this extra level, this extra point of interest, we know how much time it'll save us if we cut it out. So let's try to remove a little bit of content in order to meet that new milestone. Unfortunately, cuts happen, right? So what does an alpha look like? An alpha is a feature complete, though barren and buggy husk of a game. You know, your white box and everything, things are barely working at kind of minimum quality, right? But at least your game should be feature complete. And often what a lot of like story driven games will do is their alpha is fully playable, all the quests from start to finish. It just might have a lot of bugs. There may not be some of the side content yet, but at least the core, like the spinal cord of your game is there. From start to finish, you can get there. Full game scope should be quite visible and easy to calculate at this point, barring any unforeseen circumstances or issues, of course. So you can kind of see, are we going to meet our deadline? Are we not? What can we work with? And some assets may still be placeholder or basic. And in some cases, they may be non-existent. Voice acting, translations, things like that, especially, UI iteration is done kind of later because you are constantly changing what you want to show to the player. And of course, the voice acting and translations happen near to the end of it because you're still making adjustments to how like a quest happens, or when certain lines are told, or if maybe the writers need to make some changes. And it's not smart to do a whole bunch of that stuff while it's still being changed consistently and constantly. But your gameplay loop and features are a bit more polished. Again, you've already defined your gameplay loop in the vertical slice. You may just have made some more iterations on it, some more features to account for parts of it that you didn't see before. Maybe you didn't know that the player needs to also be able to pick up other objects other than just one. Well, you already have the pickup logic in there. Now they can pick up more than just that. And maybe you also go back to your vertical slice area to augment it a bit more with those new changes and iterations. But that's often also why you sometimes see vertical slice sections which are sometimes missing some of the newer features that are in other parts of the game, or sometimes even feel a little less polished than other parts of the game. And it's just because of the constant iteration that's done in later phases like the alpha. So what does it look like going from alpha to beta? Core features and mechanics undergo iterations to reach their final desired state. Remember, when you reach the beta phase, we'll get to it, but really this is kind of your first test of, hey, do we have everything that we need? Content is added to the game, replacing all placeholder assets. Just keep replacing placeholder assets, keep getting it all to release quality. Levels are finalized, core bugs are being fixed until the game's playability expands, but there may still be some non-crucial bugs that are pushed back for later. It's very simple. It's kind of like alpha, but you're reaching the finish line for different teams and different places. You know, your designers might not have much work to do, especially your like high-level designers, or your narrative designers might not have much work, and they could be pushed to other projects, to their next project, right? Because ideally you want to start working on your next game somewhere in this phase. Because as we've talked about in pre-production, the more time you can spend here, the better. And ideally a company wants to go from ending production of their game to a small break and then starting production of their next game. So you need to have this pre-production either done or nearly done here so that it's ready for when the team one finishes this game, they can start working on the next one without too much like, what's going on? What are we doing? Where were we? Okay, here. What does a beta look like? Core game features are locked, though art, audio, and smaller aspects may still need a few additions if found to be missing or off. What does it mean for a core game feature to be locked? It's really just like a content lock. We're not going to iterate this any further. We're not going to be adding any new features. What we have is what's going to be in the game. Sometimes called a content lock, though a content lock happens around this area sometime. No more content in the game, just polish, bug fix, small fixes if needed. All game features have undergone iterations and are in their desirable states. No major work to do on them, as we just kind of talked about. Game balance is probably a bit off, again, as you've just locked in features and you're still adding some of the content. Designers are probably still going through balance, so it may not be the greatest in this phase. Lots of bugs and lack of polish, though game is fully playable. If you've ever played a beta, or if you've ever gotten into a public beta, you probably understand this. It's not very well balanced because they haven't done large-scale playtesting. There are still bugs and issues and small changes that could be made to make it feel better, like quality of life changes. But everything that is going to be in the final game is probably on display there. Moving from beta to release is usually considered the polishing phase of the game, right? Testing, fixing, optimization, balancing, and polishing. Only crucial changes and additions are made and only if considered to be game breaking in some way. This is not the time to make excuses and push a new feature. Trust me, I've seen it happen. It's not a good idea. You should just save it for post-release, build upon it properly, prototype it, tell players that you're working on it. Localization is obtained for all desired languages and tested. Some team members may be moved to post-release content or other projects, and the game will go gold closer to this release phase in most cases. And that just means that you have a build that you're ready to upload or set to live, essentially. And it may still need some testing. You may still have a day one patch. And let me explain why day one patches are existing. Just because I know that to gamers, they may not really understand that much, and it's unfortunate. So when you go gold, when you provide a build, especially for consoles, they have to undergo their own testing, and this can take time. So if your release date, like let's say is the 1st of December, they may need a build to release on that day 2 to 3 weeks prior. So you are actually giving them the release build many weeks prior to that, and you can't give them a new one because it'll just delay the release. So you need to give them a release, but you still have time, 2 to 3 weeks, to perform some polishing and bug fixing, and that way you have a day one patch ready from all of the work that's been done before you've given them the build and the game is actually released. So it's not like they're not unnecessary. In fact, it just shows that that developers have been working on fixes and improvements in the time between giving the build to a distributor and the time of release. Okay, last one. Kind of. What is a release? The ideally release, the game is in a completely finished state. All crucial bugs, as many as non-crucial ones, are as many as possible are fixed. Celebration and rest, except for those who have to fix day one bugs. It happens, but especially on PC, you have so many combinations of computers and operating systems and drivers and third-party programs. You never know what's going to clash, and there are inevitably going to be bugs that happen. And some developers can't celebrate necessarily because they need to be fixing those day one bugs. I know some developers they give a certain number of team members breaks, like a 1 week vacation before release, so that they can come back on release and just work on bugs. But it's different per studio. Publishers and producers likely already have post-release content in mind or in development. Absolutely. This is 100% the case. Usually if there's a DLC, releasing pretty soon after the game. Okay, if there's DLC that's been released on day one, that's called cut content, okay? Now it could be free DLC, right? Like an extra game mode or HD textures. This isn't really the same thing, but if there's a second pack of cars for your driving game released on the same day as release, that is called cut content. If it was ready for day one, it was ready for the main game. I'll tell you that. But really, you want to plan some of this stuff ahead of time so that when the game comes out, you can start to work on new content for the game, that you aren't just sitting there like, well, we have to plan it now, we have to think, we have a week where we're just not working. So that happens beforehand. And last but not least, we have post-production. This is an optional part of game development. Not all games need or have post-production, but really, of course, bug fixes, optimization, but you also have new content in the form of like DLC, free updates, whatever, what have you. New post-release content can take many forms, but the goals are to retain player engagement, obtain new players, or to make more money off of existing players. Obviously, right? You don't release DLC unless you think that you can, paid DLC unless you think that you can get a return on investment on it. Obviously, it can be used as a great way to retain players. You've put out your game, you think that you want to keep players on to play more because it helps to boost your sales and your place on top seller charts or on wish lists and such. And usually smaller crews work on post-release content, while others are moved onwards to other projects. And that, after much talking and much drinking of water, is the end of what we define as production phases and how they look. Are there any comments from Twitch that we can put into the YouTube video? Any questions? Any things that you think that we were wrong about, or that we should improve, or that weren't very well explained? And of course, if you're watching on YouTube, feel free to put questions or comments in the comment section, or join us on Discord where you can kind of talk with us directly about all of this. If not, if there are no other questions or comments, thank you for watching this. I'm going to end the recording there for YouTube because we're going to be putting this up on YouTube. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to give this a like, share it with other developers or friends, and have a nice day.